Start because again today we have a very tight schedule. So good morning from, of course, sunny Dubai. It's 11 o'clock here, 11 in the morning. I know it's crazy timing everywhere else, but as I was telling Caroline, that's one of the many crazy challenges that we had to make very difficult decisions about. What was the time frame that we were going to choose? And Debbie asked, why was this weekend? Because originally this was going to be a physical conference. We wanted to help everybody with their schedules to be able to not take too many days off. That's why we had scheduled it over the weekend. But when it became online, it kind of became even more challenging for everyone because you are where you are and you've got your regular schedule still going ahead. So thank you so much to the entire community of delegates who've been joining us for the last 2 days. This is our third day, so the final stretch. We are hoping, like Debbie said, we've figured out all the craziness that can happen, and hopefully we'll be on top of it. And we really, really appreciate all of your support and patience and understanding. And I think it has to do with our communities in general, that we are actually very kind. You have to be if you're dealing with academic integrity issues among students and peers and researchers. So thank you once again and welcome to day 3. So as you know, we have our the second keynote of this conference, and the first for the day, which is of course by Professor Tracey Bretag. I'm going to quickly share the screen. We have her recording, so we will be playing that. Irene has been kind enough to reach out to her, see if she is able to be available on chat today. Of course, Tracey really does not need, and I wouldn't do justice to her even if I tried to give her an introduction. And of course, as our Lifetime Achievement Award winner for NI, here's Tracey Bretag, everybody. Is everyone able to see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Let's just try the voice.
Greetings, colleagues. It's my great pleasure to be here today. How I wish I was with you in person, but I hope you'll forgive me given the current circumstances around the world. I'm really pleased to provide this short keynote entitled Leading by Example, Reflecting on Our Own Academic Practice. This is a topic that's been preoccupying me actually for quite a while, as you'll see as I progress through the presentation. On the front page of the presentation are my contact details, as you can see, tracy.bretag@unisa.edu.au. Please use my hashtag, the hashtag academic integrity, and my Twitter handle is @TracyBretag. I'll give these contact details again at the end of the presentation. We are not so different. That was the title of a presentation I gave at the ICAI 2015 conference in Vancouver. I had the honour of introducing that conference as the president of the executive board. And I shared some insights in that presentation from the recent task I'd had of editing the Handbook of Academic Integrity. Many of you will know that book. It was published in 2016. I had just come from editing it. There were 92 authors, about 300 reviewers involved, 70 odd chapters, over 1,000 pages. In fact, I think you have a couple of copies here as some prizes for best papers, so you'll see the book. And I had just come from finishing that task, and I felt I learned a lot about us as academics, and I had some insights into the fact that we're not so different as students. So today, before I begin the formal part of my presentation, I wanted to read a couple of excerpts from that presentation because they seem very appropriate today as well. What I said in 2015 still holds in 2020. We complain a lot about students. They're lazy. They don't read instructions. They don't understand that a due date is a due date. They're always asking for extensions. They think it's okay to stick a bunch of information in an assignment without references. Their grammar is poor and their sentence construction atrocious. They never respond to emails. They always have excuses about why they haven't done their work on time. They're not engaged with the subject. They can't even follow, excuse me, a template. Their reference list, if they have one, is a mess of mixed styles. They ask stupid questions when the information is right in front of them. They disregard feedback. They ask their friends for advice rather than the person actually marking their work. They complain about all sorts of things, not least the requirements of the task at hand. And after all that, they expect us to congratulate them and tell them that their work is brilliant. Does that ring any bells? But hang on, was I talking about students? No, I was actually describing academics. Academics with PhDs and all sorts of other fancy qualifications. I was describing academics who submit papers to journals and chapters to books, and should I say papers to conferences. I was describing myself, in fact, and all of my colleagues. I was describing everyone in this room. Please don't feel smug and think this doesn't apply to you. It does. We academics, perhaps especially those of us who care most passionately about academic integrity and spend our lives teaching and presenting on the issue, might just be the worst of all. So if I was to describe ourselves, I'd use the exact same description. We're lazy, we don't read instructions, we don't understand that a due date's a due date. We're always asking for extensions. We sometimes think it's okay to stick a bunch of information in there without any references. And just like students, too often our grammar is poor and our sentence construction atrocious. We don't respond to emails. I guess we think we're too busy. We always have excuses about why we haven't done our work on time. And surprisingly, even on this topic, which we say we care so much about, sometimes we don't seem to be very engaged at all. And just like students, we often don't follow the template. I'm talking about myself here as well. And our reference lists are a mess. We ask stupid questions, even when the information's been given to us. We disregard feedback. We ask other colleagues for advice rather than the editor. We complain about all sorts of things, including stuff that's completely outside the control of the editor. And after all that, just like our students, we expect congratulations and praise for our brilliant contributions. So I've been working on this topic for 2 decades, and the work goes back even further to about 3 decades, really, with the seminal work of John McCabe and his colleagues. We could say it even went back to the 60s with William Bauer. But I really think we've had major strides in 3 decades. And in that time, while the original focus was on students cheating, we have come to understand that students cheating isn't just something that's a personal issue or a moral issue, though it's all of those. It's actually a symptom of much wider systemic issues. And we also know now that academic misconduct is not confined to students. It can be found in all aspects and stakeholders of the academic community. So I think it is time now, as we reach maturity as an academic integrity community, to take a really good hard look at our own academic practices. Are we leading by example? Do we demonstrate outstanding scholarship characterised by generous and accurate acknowledgement of others' contributions to our own achievements? Very recently on Twitter, some of you may follow Amanda's Audit, which is a Dr. Amanda White at UTS and a lovely colleague of mine in Australia. She had started a thread with this question: what would be one practical and relatively easy change you would ask academics to do to improve academic integrity? And she said nothing that requires policy change, because often that's out of our hands. And my answer, almost without thinking, was that we need to model academic integrity. And I said we need to do that in all of our teaching materials, for example, through excellent referencing, appropriate paraphrasing, generous acknowledgement of others' contributions, etc. And many other people gave fantastic suggestions related to education, embedding study skills support, assessment design, student-teacher relationships, student wellbeing, reporting breaches, and reflecting on our own teaching practice. And all of those things are vital if we want to improve academic integrity. But I go back to my first point, which is that we need to be modelling academic integrity, and by that I mean leading by example. We can't ask students to do what we ourselves don't do. Where's our focus? Do we place our own career aspirations ahead of reliable and trustworthy research? Now, as an editor of a journal, and you'll know that the International Journal for Educational Integrity is sponsoring this event, and you'll have the opportunity to submit papers to the journal, which is published by Springer Nature. So as an editor, I certainly see a lot of very rushed and half-baked papers, and I know why that happens. I do it myself. I'm rushing to get papers in because I have to meet certain university KPIs, key performance indicators. I am under a lot of pressure, just as everyone in this room is too. But submitting very poor work is in no way leading by example. Another thing I see is clearly work that has not met ethical obligations. I see work that clearly has not gone through the appropriate ethics approval for research, and automatically that research is going to be desk rejected. Again, I know it takes time, our processes are unwieldy, but that doesn't give us any excuse not to follow appropriate processes if we are leading by example. And are we taking our time to fully, accurately and rigorously analyse data? Again, I see people with fantastic ideas for research, but they're just putting their papers in too quickly. Their analysis is like a page. It doesn't tell us much. It doesn't contribute much to the literature. And again, it's likely to have a desk reject. As an editor, excuse me, I hate to desk reject. I myself hate to have my own papers rejected before they've gone out for review. But it happens because we're rushing too quickly to put our papers in. That happens because we've got pressures from above. But even worse than that, are we putting our careers ahead of our relationships with students and colleagues? So remember, academic integrity is not just about what we do with text, it's what we do with people. So do we put our research output ahead of innovative and engaging assessment? Again, we probably do that because that's what we're being rewarded for. But innovative and engaging assessment is going to be one of the key pillars to promoting academic integrity, as we saw in Amanda's Twitter thread. Do we truly take the time to get to know our students, even when that means we have less time to work on our latest paper? And are we generous with our time with early career researchers? And do we truly include and acknowledge our colleagues' contributions, or are we busy taking all the glory ourselves? I'll talk some more about this throughout the presentation. So I think if we're going to be leading by example, we need to demonstrate integrity in every single aspect of our very complex academic lives. I've got a list here of the sort of roles I know we all play, and I probably haven't listed them all. They're just the ones that immediately came to mind. Our roles as teachers, scholars, researchers, collaborators, colleagues, supervisors, authors, editors, reviewers, presenters, conference conveners, grant applications and assessors, and social media commentators. And I'll take you through each one of those points in turn. First of all, as teachers, and I should acknowledge this lovely photo of Amanda White because she really did give me such an inspiration with her Twitter thread. So her question was, what's the one thing you could do? I guess I should also mention, I've said we need to model academic integrity, but I think we need to do so much more than simply try to improve students' academic integrity. We need to make, as teachers, students and students' learning our priority. Now that's despite that managerial pressure to do otherwise I've already discussed, and despite the fact that teaching and learning is undervalued and unrecognised, despite the fact that we're overburdened with administration and other busy work. And here's the thing, if as teachers we don't have the teaching skills and expertise that we know we need, particularly in this current environment where we're changing all of our teaching right now to meet a particular need because of the coronavirus and needing to reach our students where they are, if we don't have those skills, we need to proactively seek them out. We need to actually get the professional development to do that. That's our responsibility as teachers. As scholars, we need to ask ourselves, do we stay up to date with the scholarship in our respective fields, or are we just hashing out the same old scholarship from a decade ago in our teaching materials? So we need to ensure that we demonstrate the same genuine engagement and rigorous scholarship that we expect of our students. And that means up-to-date resources. I hear staff say you can only use sources within a particular range, say 2010 to 2020, and then I look at their teaching materials and it's like the 90s, and I'm not talking about seminal work here, just old rehashed materials. I'm as guilty as anyone, so I certainly don't mean to be pointing the finger. I point the finger at myself. We need to use up-to-date resources, And we need to be using careful and consistent referencing. Again, I'm as guilty as anyone on that. I use APA 5th or 6th in my research, but my own university and my own faculty uses Harvard, and I often mix the two up. I need to be watching that. We need to make sure that all the links to research is live. We can't ask our students to be hitting a link if it doesn't go anywhere. And just like we ask our students to provide a coherent and objective argumentation, we need to be doing the same thing, not just putting a whole bunch of disjointed PowerPoints together and calling it a lecture. And just as we ask our students to do this, we need to explore alternative perspectives and not just provide our own particular view of the topic. And as researchers, we all know, I'm sure everyone in this room knows, there are 8 principles variously worded around the world of integrity, research integrity, and they correspond pretty closely to those principles of academic integrity. So you can see the first one is honesty, and that means we need to be truthful and accurate in proposing, conducting and reporting research. Fair enough, you think you won't, you would never be guilty of not being honest in that way. But again, if we're rushing to put papers in, we're not fully and accurately reporting data, that's really a form of academic dishonesty, research dishonesty. We need to demonstrate rigor, and that means attention to detail, a robust methodology and avoiding bias. Now, again, in terms of my role as an editor, so often papers are rejected because the methodology is seriously flawed. People have got their funding, they've been successful in their grant application, and then they've rushed out to collect the data before fully understanding and documenting and carefully wording and making sure they follow an appropriate research protocol based on rigorous methodology. And those papers, no matter how well written, will be rejected straight out of hand. We need to be transparent, and that means communicating our research openly and accurately and disclosing potential conflicts of interest. Just as we ask our students, we need to demonstrate fairness. And you'll see here in research integrity, they don't even talk about text particularly. They talk about treating others fairly and with respect. That means our colleagues and our collaborators and the people in our research teams and our students. Of course, it also means appropriately citing the work of others and giving credit where it's due for authorship, and we'll talk a bit about that in a second. We need to demonstrate respect, and that again means treating humans, communities, animals and the environment with respect. So often we get caught up about academic integrity being about what students do with text, but it's actually what we all do as part of members of our community. In the Australian context, we are required, and we should all have a commitment to recognising, valuing and respecting the diversity, in Australia anyway, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, our First Peoples. I'm sure in your own context you have particular community groups that you also need to recognise and respect. We need to be accountable, and that means complying, and much more than complying, being committed to complying with legislation and policies and ensuring good stewardship of public resources. When we are fortunate enough to have won a large grant or any sort of grant, whether it's internal funding or external, that funding is a huge responsibility. We need to be absolutely accountable and demonstrate good stewardship of what we use that money for. That doesn't mean long lunches with our colleagues. If we said it was going to be used to collect data, that doesn't include lunches and parties and social outings. And in the Australian context, the 8th principle is that not just do we need to be committed to and comply with those various other principles, we need to actively promote a research culture which supports responsible, ethical conduct of research. So we have a responsibility to promote it as well as doing it ourselves. So that's thinking about how we lead by example as researchers. What about as collaborators? As I've said, academic and research integrity is not just about how text is produced by students or ourselves, it's about relationships. And we need to be aware about publication ethics. Now that requires an understanding of the roles and responsibilities of all the various stakeholders in any given publication. We don't need to make that up. We need to look at the various flowcharts and guidelines provided by the Committee on Publication Ethics, and I'll give you the link to that at the end of this presentation. The COPE, Committee on Publication Ethics, I'll talk a bit about more of that in a second, provides guidelines on just about every aspect from the beginning right through to the final publication of research and everything in between. In particular, we need to not only acknowledge collaborators, but be generous in our encouragement and support of potential collaborators. Sometimes we find ourselves shutting others out, but we actually have an opportunity to include them. Let's ask ourselves, why do we do this? Why are we not being generous when people come to us and hope to be part of our team or seek some mentorship or want some advice? Are we being generous in our encouragement of them? And how could we be better in that regard? As colleagues, and I should mention this photo is of my team for the Contract Cheating and Assessment Design project. It includes not just our key researchers who are in the team, but also our project manager and people who are helping us with data analysis. And this photo comes from 2017 at our symposium. You might recognise some of the people in the photo. So we think of that as our colleagues if we have a research team, but colleagues could include so many people. It could be people who work in the same corridor, those in our teaching teams. It might be new members of faculty, people who come and join us, junior academics or senior academics. It might be our managers, heads of school or deans. It could be people in other faculties, and it could be staff and student representatives on the various committees that we work on. And it could even be people, professional staff in administrative units, for example, how we collaborate and work with people in our teaching and learning unit, the library, student support, even facilities management. So how are we supporting and encouraging those colleagues who don't immediately come to mind as our collaborators, but how are we supporting them not just in how we promote academic integrity to students, but just as part of our daily practice as good academic citizens? The question to ask, I think, is, are we models of integrity in absolutely everything we do? And again, I want to keep reminding you as an audience that when I'm asking these questions, I'm asking them of myself as much as I'm asking you to consider your own practice. How about our role as supervisors? And we have many supervisory roles. As a principal teacher, perhaps a head of a teaching team, as supervisors or mentors of PhD, masters or honours students, as teaching and learning leaders, and of course in our role, which I hope all of us have here, whether it's formal or informal, as academic integrity leaders and mentors. So how do we demonstrate integrity in those roles? Do we share resources? Do we share all those wonderful things we've already learned 10 years ago that our new colleagues are just starting to learn? We don't want them to have to reinvent the wheel. Do we invite students and colleagues to co-author papers, maybe to be part of our grant applications or our conference presentations? Do we facilitate others' participation in conferences? For example, I'm thinking of our PhD students who often have very limited funding. Do we facilitate their participation, which we know will provide an amazing opportunity for networking? And once again, do we give credit where it's due? We know that a major issue, the research tells us for many graduate students, is their supervisors literally stealing their work, literally stealing it and putting their own name on it, or even just not acknowledging them appropriately in the contribution they've made. So we need to be always thinking about how we give credit where it's due. If you're a supervisor of a student, you do not automatically get to be the first author or even an author at all. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Here it is. So we need to really follow the COPE guidelines, the Committee on Publication Ethics, as well as our various national and institutional policies on what makes an author. Now, one example is the one from my own university, which follows the 2007 Code for Responsible Conduct of Research. And according to my university, in all cases, authorship must be based on substantial contributions in a combination of three things, not just one of these things, but a combination of these three things. The first one is conception and design of the project. The second is analysis and interpretation of research data. And the third is drafting significant parts of the work or critically revising it so as to contribute to the interpretation. So often people fight about the roles of authors, who's first, who's second, and so on. That's tricky enough, and COPE will provide guidelines for that as well. But you cannot just claim authorship because you gave some advice to a graduate student or you suggested some editorial changes. That gives you a nice little acknowledgement, a paragraph. It doesn't give you the right to be an author. And as our code says, the right to authorship is not tied to your position or your profession. So just because you're the supervisor or just because you're the senior professor or head of the lab does not make you an author, according to this code. and certainly according to the code that I follow. And it doesn't depend on whether the contribution was paid or voluntary. I've heard people say, well, I paid that research student X amount of money to do the data analysis and to help me with X, Y, and Z, so they don't need to be an author. They've already been paid. No, not true. Similarly, not true, just because somebody volunteered their time doesn't mean that they can't be an author. Our code says it's not enough to have provided materials or routine technical support or to have made the measurements on which the publication's based, because that would just be one small part of the overall publication. That's 3 things you need, not just one. So substantial intellectual contribution in all those 3 areas is required. And also, a person who qualifies as an author must not be included or excluded as an author without their express permission. Now, I know even at this conference there's been misunderstandings by some contributors around what makes an author. You can't just stick somebody's name on an abstract as if they are an author without their permission and without their contribution. These are such important matters that I myself would consider it an egregious research misconduct to put somebody else's name on an abstract or a paper when they in fact had nothing to do with the research and didn't even know you were putting your name on it. So I think that's a lesson to take away, especially for junior researchers who are perhaps not as familiar as they need to be with appropriate codes of conduct. Of course, in my role as an editor of the Handbook of Academic Integrity, I'm also just finished editing another new volume called An Agenda for Research Integrity. Pardon me, An Agenda for Academic Integrity Research. And my role as the editor of the International Journal for Educational Integrity. I think a lot about the role of the reviewers. In fact, COPE has just put out a discussion paper asking people to consider if an editor has the right to change a reviewer's words. Now, you may think, oh, no, they certainly shouldn't do that. But I'll tell you right now, as an editor, that I have on many occasions changed a reviewer's words because they are quite frankly rude, dismissive, derogatory, personally insulting to the author. So if you accept an assignment to review a paper, do you provide useful and specific feedback for revisions? And that means a whole lot more than just a quick paragraph. It means you've got to go through every aspect of the paper. That's your job as a reviewer. You are mentoring this author and giving them an opportunity, even if the paper's rejected, to improve. You would want that from a review, and so does any other author. You need to aim to avoid bias. If you can identify the author, and I know in our field it's quite a tight community, you may in fact identify who it is. At the very least, you have a responsibility to alert the editor that that's the case. Do you use respectful and supportive language? You're assessing the paper, not the person who wrote it. And that's what happens when an editor has to step in and actually soften the language, because we don't want to crush aspiring authors. We certainly wouldn't like it ourselves. So we shouldn't do it for any other authors. And here's another incredible thing. You may have every intention to provide that review by the due date, but you wait for a 2nd or 3rd or 4th reminder from the editor. That's just not cool. That's not respectful. The author is waiting, and as we all know, their career may be dependent on getting that paper published this year, or sometime soon anyway. So if you accept an assignment, please do submit the work by the due date. And if you're not qualified to assess the paper, you have a responsibility, no matter how much pressure you may feel from the editor, to not accept the assignment. You don't know the topic, you don't know the field, you don't know the literature, perhaps you don't know the methodology. Don't accept it. And I've mentioned my role a couple of times as editor of the International Journal for Educational Integrity, and I've also mentioned COPE a few times. Now here are some of the core practices that COPE provides guidelines on. You can see allegations of misconduct, authorship and contributorship, complaints and appeals, and so on. It is an amazing resource which I highly recommend. As an editor, you need to think about, if you're rejecting a paper, why are you rejecting that paper? On which criteria? And have you made that transparent to the author? As editors, we need to ask, how do we choose reviewers? Is it just because they're our friends and we think they'll get it done, or are they suitably qualified? And how do we mentor and support new authors? As editors, we actually have a much bigger role than just being a gatekeeper, particularly in a relatively small field like our own. Of course, we're all at a conference right now, so you have a role to lead by example as a presenter. So again, do we generously acknowledge others' contributions? Or do we bask in the glory as if we alone are responsible for the research, the findings, or the analysis? I ask myself this question a lot. I've led a lot of projects, and I started to think, well, why am I the one being invited to be a keynote, or why am I invited to present these findings? I should ask my co-leader or one of my team members to do it. They're more than competent to do so, and perhaps it's an opportunity that will help their career. So instead of grabbing every opportunity to present your team's research, maybe think about providing opportunities to others. Again, we need to ask ourselves, what is stopping us from being generous and gracious? What about our role as conference conveners? Not everybody's going to do that, but I've convened at least 2 big conferences in my time. I know many people in this room have done the same, particularly when we're in a small field. You may have that role. So as conference conveners, it isn't just about getting as many presenters and attendees as we can. It's actually much more important than that. We have a responsibility to ensure that only rigorous, trustworthy and peer-reviewed research is presented. A successful conference is one that contributes to the literature, not that provides an opportunity for lots of people to socialise. Nonetheless, that is important, of course, to network, but it's more about what we're contributing to the field. We need to ask about sponsorship and the criteria we use when we're seeking sponsorship from commercial entities. Are the values of those companies aligned with those of academic integrity? We need to ask about the criteria we use to ask peer reviewers to contribute. Are we overburdening them? If we're asking them to do 10 reviews in a very short period of time, that's just unfair. Really think through what would be a really fair and reasonable workload. What could you yourself handle? And finally, do we ensure that conference proceedings are of the absolute highest standard, not just in terms of the research, which I've also mentioned, but in terms of editing? It should be a very professional piece of work because, again, it's going to stand as a testament to the work presented at the conference. What about in our role as grant applicants or assessors? So as an applicant, are we more concerned with obtaining that income, that research income, which we know we're all under pressure to get? Or shouldn't we be more concerned with ensuring high quality research which really makes a difference to the community we're representing? In our case, we're representing the higher education community. We're representing students. We're representing teachers, practitioners, instructors, lecturers, professors, and administrative staff in higher education. Are we really making a contribution to that environment, or are we just concerned about getting the money? What about in your role as an assessor of grant applications? Many of you in this room will have been in that position. So we need to be asking ourselves, do we allow our methodological and disciplinary viewpoints to cloud our judgment of quality research? Do we keep our minds open to new perspectives? Perhaps we find ourselves very often awarding grants to high-flying professors, regardless of the quality of the application. You think, well, they've had runs on the board, I guess they're a sure bet. Maybe we need to be questioning that. As assessors, do we keep those 8 principles of research integrity front and centre? Because if we do, it's highly likely we're going to identify research misconduct. And if we do identify that, to whom do we report it? Are we even reporting it, or do we think that's somebody else's job? Finally, and as I say, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's the list I can get through in about 30 minutes. Many people in this room use social media really effectively. One of the things I love about the academic integrity community is that Twitter has provided a platform for us to all connect right across the world. And by and large, I think we're a pretty supportive community. One of the things, of course, again, we need to be asking is, do we uphold those values of academic integrity, honesty, trust, respect, fairness, responsibility and courage in every one of our posts? Or do we use social media to advance our own agenda? Perhaps we use it to disparage others' work, or even exclude some people from the conversation. I think we have an opportunity to use social media to welcome newcomers to the community, We, especially PhD students, people just starting out in their research, we can use social media to support new lines of inquiry and even promote the work of colleagues that we don't necessarily agree with, but we can respectfully disagree with their perspectives and still support them in this environment. So just in conclusion, I've taken you on a whirlwind tour of all the various roles that we have as academics and just some ideas of how we might lead by example. I hope I've convinced you that in our various roles, we have a duty to do that, to lead by example, to be role models of academic integrity. And I know this is easier said than done because our lives are complex. We're under the same pressures as everybody else in academia. But if we want our students to act with academic integrity, they have to be able to look to us as exemplars. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. I might have confused you a little bit or left you with many more questions than you started with. The aim of the presentation wasn't for you to go away thinking, yes, tick, 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 I understand all of that, but to really start you thinking about what we can do in our own day-to-day practice, how we might reflect on everything we do every day to act as exemplars and leaders of academic integrity. I promised some references at the end so that you can find those links directly. And also, if you'd like to contact me, I'd be really happy to do so. That's my email address. Please do tag me on Twitter if you want to talk about any of these various topics. You can find more information about me on my university homepage and, of course, through the International Journal for Educational Integrity. I should take this moment too to recognise that my lovely colleague, Dr. Sarah Eaton at the University of Calgary, is now co-editing the journal with me, so I'm really pleased to have her on board as well. It's been my great pleasure to be a small part of the conference. I wish you all the best. I hope there are lots of wonderful, stimulating and life-changing conversations, and I look forward to watching the Twitter feed. All the best.